Compañeros, welcome to another edition of the SQL Partners podcast. I am Carlos El Chacon, your host, and this is episode 123. So we would like to excuse Steve Stedman. He's not with us this episode, so that's unfortunate. But the good news is he'll be back next episode. We're looking forward to having him. We're doing something a little different this episode. Of course, if you're a longtime podcast listener, you won't notice. However, we are trying to incorporate some video into this episode. So if you are joining us via YouTube, welcome. And of course, for you longtime compañeros, welcome back to the program. It's good to be back with you. Today's topic is 5 things developers should know when they get admin access to a SQL Server. For a lot of you developers out there, you don't have DBAs. We know that there are more and more of you listening to the program. And so actually in 2018, we are trying to gear more of our content to you so we can help bridge that gap and help you be better prepared as you're trying to tackle some of these administrative tasks while you're developing. And so this topic was suggested by listener Eduardo Cervantes. So we thank Eduardo for suggesting this topic and sending it our way. So before we get into that, we do have a couple of compañero shoutouts. We want to give a shout out to Aaron Hayes. Aaron Hayes is ready for the SQL Trail event. Hooray! So Aaron joined us last year in 2017, and looking forward to another great event. I know we are still trying to work some of these details out. We haven't announced the 2018 event just yet, but hopefully that will be coming fairly soon. We've been working with some sponsors and looking to do some things with some labs. And so that'll be exciting once that finally gets announced. Vivek Patel reaching out on LinkedIn. Hey, Vivek. Nathan Hills chimed in on episode 114 on getting started with consulting. He thought that was kind of interesting. So thanks for that feedback, Nathan. And Chris Voss shouting out, sharing some enthusiasm for having developers on the show. I know we made fun of Bert a little bit in episode 120. And Chris said that, hey, glad to have developers on the program because there's hope for the rest of us. So Chris, thanks for that. And we are trying to do, like I mentioned, a bit more content for you developers. So welcome, and it's great to have you as compañeros. And then Davey, all the way from Langholm, Scotland, chimed in. Really enjoyed the podcast. Really well structured. Surprised how much I know, and horrified there is so much that I don't know. So Davey, yes, join the rest of us in not knowing a whole lot, and we look forward to having you around for future episodes. So we did promise you, compañeros, that in 2018 we would include a tips and tricks segment. This obviously was user suggested, and we've been soliciting some ideas, and I have to admit I'm a little concerned. Those ideas aren't coming in quite as rapidly as we would like. So we're gonna go ahead and start sharing some of the ones that we put together, and I think that maybe you will be surprised at potentially how simple they are, and this idea of, again, just sharing the way that we work. And so for this tips and trick, I'm going to be using the power of video here. So let's say that we wanted to pull some data from a database, or we wanted to copy some data from the internet, right? And it's not formed well. In this example that I'm using, I'm actually just doing select star from sys databases, and I have this, and let's say I want to put it in a report or something, and I want to format this for whatever reason. In this case, I've actually put the output to text so that I can get that format so that it lines up correctly. Because if I do it from grid and copy there, the headers get all messed up from the body. So I run that select query, I copy the results, and then I want to do, again, something with that. So I'm going to paste that. In this case, I'm pasting it into SQL Server Management Studio, but this will actually also work in Word and the other Office products. And so I have, what I see here is I have a lot of white space in between some of the columns. Or let's just say there's a column that I didn't want to include in my report. So for example, I know that by policy is auto shrink on. It's not something that I'm ever going to have to take care of, but I don't want to have to go through each line and delete that data from the line. So one of the things I can do is I click where I want to start, and I'm going to hold down the Alt key. If I hold down the Alt key, then I can click and drag, and what that will allow me to do is to get blocks of data, or blocks of columns, if you will, and I can select that and remove it, and it will, all of the rows will line up nicely. And so this is particularly useful, again, more for white space, where there's white space I just want to take out, but it's in multiple rows. So I would click there, hold down the Alt key, and I can do that. And again, the size doesn't really matter. And so I find that to be really helpful when I want to do some formatting, and so I hope that you'll find that useful if you're not already using it. And so that is the podcast tip and trick for this week. And now, time for a little SQL Server in the news. So perhaps not news. It was announced. I know at PASS. I think they introduced it at PASS Summit last year in October. And this is the SQL Operations Studio. What is news is that they have started, very similar to the SQL Server Management Studio, is that they have started to introduce monthly updates to this program. And so for those of you who are not familiar with the SQL Operations Studio, the SQL Operations Studio is the new tool, and it is ultimately an interface, a visual interface to be able to connect to SQL Server in a visual way, but that runs on Linux and Windows. And so for those of us who have been using SQL Server Management Studio for some time, you're going to find some of the features lacking, right? So don't get too concerned here. I think there are some very interesting developments that are happening and that are coming. And talking with the product team, again, when I was out in Seattle, there are some things coming, but it's just like everything. It will be slow coming. So kicking the tires a little bit on the SQL Operations Studio. Again, so you'll, very similar to SQL Server Management Studio, I can connect to a server. I can see some of my databases. I can write queries, select the database that I want to run the query against. There we go. I can change the database and run it against that database. So again, all very, very, very simple, if you will. If you've been using Visual Studio to do some SQL Server queries, that's probably a little bit more familiar in the sense of you're specific to writing those queries. A lot of the administrative type tasks, not baked in, and I'm not sure that they'll come. SQL Server Management Studio is probably still going to be the place for you to do that, but there are some different things that they're trying to do here with the Operations Studio. One of which I know, and again, talking with the product team, that they're going to allow us to do is to create these reports, if you will, and then tag them onto the dashboard. So here they have a couple, so backup status and search databases. And you can actually go in here and run the query, and that's what this is. And it will show you the data behind the query. What at least this knuckle-dragging Neanderthal hasn't been able to figure out just yet is how to take a query that I've written and then put it into the dashboard. I believe that's going to be coming. Maybe it's already there, and again, I just don't know how to do that. I found it difficult. I couldn't immediately find the documentation to do that, but I know that it is coming. So again, it'll be exciting to see kind of what happens with the Operations Studio. Not super feature rich. But particularly if you're in an environment where you've started using Linux, but want that visual way to be able to connect to the database and start doing something with it, then again, you have that ability with SQL Operations Studio. Okay, so with that, we'll go ahead and get into the episode. The URL for the show notes today for today's episode will be SQLDataPartners.com/access. Yes, like the database, because we're talking about developers getting access to the SQL Server environment. Or you can go to SQLDataPartners.com/123. So for this conversation, and again, the idea is what developers should know as they get admin access. And so we're assuming that there is no DBA present, right? And there's kind of a shared responsibility model, right? There's not maybe a group responsible, and so you or the other developers are taking on that responsibility. And this obviously would apply to both production and development environments. I'm not necessarily going to get into specifics as to, is one different than the other. In my mind, these initial steps are going to apply to both scenarios, and then we'll go from there. So I guess the top 5 steps are: 1, do you know the consequence of your action? We like to make changes. You might run into a problem and you read on the internet, oh, you should do X thing, right? You should, change this parameter, or you should use this function, or you should enable this trace flag. While the suggestion is that that will help you solve your problem, the question you should be asking yourself is, why was this not already enabled? What is the downside to implementing this course of action? There's a reason they don't turn certain things on by default. Now, more and more, some of that is just because they don't want to break the old stuff. So if you're developing new things, right, there are lots of, those best practices evolve over time. So I get that. But at the same time, when you want to start implementing something, you need to be able to understand what the bad stuff is, what the negative is. So do you understand what that consequence and what the trade-off is? What maybe you might be subjecting yourself to now that you have taken this action that you wouldn't have otherwise? And you could potentially, could you solve that in a different way based on that knowledge? Right, so those are some that's the first thing to take in mind because when developers get that access, we tend to it's exciting, right? It's like, hey, I can finally do what I need to do, but we want to take a moment, right? Pause, think about what we're doing. The next thing is to identify the owner of the system. Now, traditionally, and I guess I'm coming, obviously, I've been the DBA for many organizations. They're going to come to me as the owner, right? So a lot of DBAs think of themselves as the gatekeeper, but you won't have that without a DBA. And if you're developers taking care of this, then who then is the owner? So from a developing concept, there's pair programming and whatnot, and there's a shared ownership idea. And so these concepts has been around in programming, and it's almost similar to say, well, who owns the code, right? Well, we all do, right? So the same could apply to the database. Now, having said that, documentation then comes into play. Now, it's easy, so source control does a great job for the stored procedures, the views, right? Even the table structure, all of that you can get into source control, and then you can say, okay, well, here's what's changed and whatnot, who changed it, things like that. What's very difficult, or what source control doesn't give you, are system setting type processes, right? So who changed the trace flag, or who allowed this action in the database. So from that perspective, you're going to have to find a way to document what those changes are, who's making them, and then again, are we all okay with making this change? With code, it's easy to, okay, well, let me work on it, let me commit it, and then people can take a peek at it and give feedback. Again, with those settings, it's a little bit harder. And so then coming up with okay, here's how I'm going to manage this, I think is an important thought process to go through. Because rolling back is very, very hard when you don't know the original state, right? How do you get back to the way we were? Which brings me then to step number 3. Always give yourself a way to get back. So obviously backups are a good way. If you're changing, parameters or system settings, writing that down. What was it? What did I change it to? Those kinds of things. That's no-brainer type stuff. But we know that database changes sometimes they can be problematic, right? Particularly as your database starts to getting large, right? Like, do I really want to take a backup? Can I just save off a table? Yeah, maybe you can. Me personally, right? I think this is one of the areas where containers are going to start playing a larger role. And obviously, if you're using containers in your development environment, the implementation of the containers into the database is going to be a no-brainer. It's going to give you that ability to be able to spin it up. Okay, let me try to make this change. Implement, right? I'm implementing something here. You could think of that as a code push as well. Is it behaving the way that I think it's behaving? Okay, yes, it is. Okay, now let me apply the same change now to my, to the database that I want to change, and it's very easy to make that leap because I have a way to be able to test that very, very easily. So I'm interested to hear how containers play a larger role in the database environment, and I think that specific scenario, so in the dev scenario, and being able to get a container of your production environment very, very quickly, without having to do all that restore, allocate all that space, it makes a lot of sense, and I think that's a great way to go if that's something that you can pull off. Obviously, the folks over at Windocs would be very happy to help you out. We're looking to partner with them and work with them and help more organizations take advantage of those containers. And so that all goes back to, right, giving yourself a way to get back, just in case, because you never know, right? You may think that you understand the consequence, but then if there's unintended consequences, give yourself a way to get back. The fourth thing is to don't forget the small stuff. So patching, security, right? Backups, boring, perhaps, but they need to be taken care of. And they do become important. Just recently, just this last week, we're getting word about the CPU bug, right? Where under certain circumstances, someone gets access and they can actually get access to the memory layer for the CPUs and see in clear text all of the things that we're trying to encrypt because it's what the CPU sees. And so again, these are very real problems. I mean, you're patching your software, for example. All the things that you develop, they're going to have bugs. Well, okay, the database is no exception. And you have to think of a way of, okay, how am I going to keep up with this stuff? Or again, who's going to take ownership of that? Or how have I looked at solving this problem? There are lots of third-party applications out there from a backups perspective. And so, again, just understanding what it is that you're getting from that point in time, how long am I going to keep those backups? Those kinds of things are things to think about. And then, of course, just because you have admin access doesn't mean that everybody else should have admin access. And so security still plays a role there, particularly from the application perspective, right? You have a web app. You don't want to be giving that user admin rights because you're just inviting the ability to be compromised, frankly, because you have bad security in place. And then the last one, so the four have been, do you know the consequences of the action, identifying the owner of the system, and if you have a shared ownership model, right, detailing who's going to make those changes and how they're going to be documented. Always give yourself a way to get back, and then don't forget the small stuff. And the last suggestion I have is to install Database Health Monitor. In my mind, it's a no-brainer. It's a visual interface. It's going to give you that ability to be able to get better insights into the database without having to look at all of the logs or know all of the queries. There are lots of reports that are baked in that are going to give you some feedback. The biggest benefit to the database health monitor is that ability is the wait stats history. So now you're going to have to install a small database, right? It's going to keep some of that history. But now when you go back and you're like, wow, at 10 a.m. this morning, I was having problems, you'll actually be able to have the history to be able to go back in there and kind of start digging around, right? What was going on? Again, lots of different ways to grow or to home grow that yourself. And if that's your option, go for it, right? But for an easy out of the box way that's free, Database Health Monitor I think is the way to go there. So, compañeros, what do you think? Do you agree with my list? I'm very interested in hearing from you. I'd be interested to get your thoughts and feedbacks. I know a lot of times, even doing some research or getting some thoughts of other people out on the internet about what their take was. Everyone seems to kind of want to limit, right? And you'll notice that I didn't give specific, hey, you should do this. Again, there are some best practices out there. But I thought that identifying some of these first steps would really be more important. And then again, even using the Database Health Monitor as an example, that will help you understand what the best practices are, and you can start implementing that, as you see fit. So you can leave comments in the show notes or reach out to us on social media. We're always interested in hearing from you. That is going to do it for today's episode. We have quite a bit of music. Our music for SQL Server in the News is by Mansardian, used under Creative Commons, as is all of the music that we used today. We hope you'll reach out to us on social media. A lot of people connecting with us on LinkedIn, and we invite you to reach out to us on LinkedIn. I am at Carlos L. Chacon, and compañeros, I'll see you on the SQL Trail.
Data Partners.